Welcome to the Moon Baby Magic podcast, a space to honor women's rites of passage stories. From menarche to menopause, the initiations of womanhood all live within our wombs. Through our first bleed to our last, we come to know ourselves more deeply. This is a platform to reclaim the sacredness of all of it. I'm your host, Natalie Elliott, birth keeper and women's coach, specializing in womb wellness and hormonal healing. Ready for slow and sacred storytelling? Let's dive in. Happy Wednesday, sweet ones. Welcome back and welcome back. Recording these intros are one of my favorite things because it feels like my little time to drop in with all of you, like we're sitting together and having our weekly tea or coffee catch up. So just sharing with you, today is November 4th. We are in the Samhain season portal, the autumn phase of the year, and I am in the autumn phase of my cycle. In the luteal phase. Today I'm on day 23. And so just really existing in that harvest energy and also recognizing that this phase of my cycle feels so good to me. It feels like one of the truest versions of myself. And it also feels like a time when I'm really open and available for ceremony, for all the festivities that come along with this time of the year that have to do with the veil thinning and the ancestors and honoring our shadows. And whoo, you all, these shadows have been shadowing. There's just been so many parts of myself that were sort of stirring beneath the surface that have been asking me to meet them. And maybe you've noticed that too. Maybe your dreams, like mine, have been really vivid. And just reminding you that this is this time of the year. I was just sharing with a one-on-one client of mine this morning, one of the 4 clients I saw this morning. And she was saying, it's sometimes hard to fall back along your health journey and feel like, oh, I'm not making forward motion. And one thing I shared with her that I received also from someone this morning was the ancient people knew that it was crazy to think that we were supposed to be growing all year long. What in nature grows all year long? Everything has a season. The earth has seasons. And so just reminding you that if you, like me, are feeling the pull to say no to social gatherings more, especially if you're in your luteal phase, but really for all of fall and winter, if you're feeling the need to nest, if you're feeling like you're not making forward motion in whatever your pursuits of creativity are, whether that's business or not, it's okay. The ancient peoples tended to take a break from Samhain to either kind of imbolc or spring equinox. And that was the ways of this world and the ways of especially those of us who have European descent. So encouraging you to tune into this episode with a sense of sitting by the fire with your sisters, preparing for a long winter, a long, nourishing winter full of story medicine, exactly what this podcast was created for. And then in spring, when you're ready to emerge, you are welcome to join us in Nicaragua for a fun and nourishing women's retreat. You can find all the details about that, about one-on-one sessions, and all of Madeline and I's info in the show notes. So today on the podcast, we have an incredibly special episode inspired by my birthday ceremony, which was co-created by myself and Madeline. Madeline, who's also been on a previous episode of this podcast, weaving her own rites of passage stories, is a very skilled and intuitive facilitator of these rites. And both her and I are passionate about bringing them back into a modern context, help communities come together and people heal. This episode is history meets transmission, meets story, meets all the practical ways you can bring ceremony into your life. Considering this entire podcast is about honoring rites of passage, this episode seems especially important, and Madeline and I both hope it's one you come back to often. All right, welcoming Madeline back to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you here again, Madeline. This is really sweet. So for those of you who don't know, Madeline was on my podcast. I guess that episode released sometime in the summer. And it was a really beautiful episode about her rites of passage, and actually the most listened to episode of this podcast now, which is so epic. And Madeline, I also have the pleasure to know from my in-person life. And she just really supported me deeply with my own rite of passage ceremony for my 29th birthday. So when Madeline and I were kind of reflecting on rites of passage after that, and she's also been through a big rite of passage that we'll get into on this episode as well, we both felt like, wow, we really need to talk about this and support the people with how they can bring rites of passage into their lives and like where this comes from and why this work is so important. And, this is a podcast mostly about women's rites of passage stories. And Madeline is one of the people I know who really walks that path really, yeah, really authentically of honoring her own rites of passage and holding space for others to honor theirs too. So, yeah, I'm really excited and thanks for being here and doing this with me, Madeline.
So honored to be here. I love you dearly, Natalie. I love the work you do. I love this podcast. And it's just so nourishing too to medicine that are walking the womb path and come together to see where our philosophies and our life paths overlap and how we because we're also tracking things collective. We're hearing women's stories often and we're supporting women in this process and seeing how these like ancient ways of being and our womanly bodies are expressing in our modern day social constructs.
Mm.
And I think rites of passages are such a profound way that we can harness both. We can tap into this ancestral knowing and then also apply that to what we're navigating, this modern landscape that we're all trying to figure out how to do well.
Yes, yeah, I love that. Because I think for some people, when they hear like rite of passage, maybe the immediate thing, and this used to be how I felt, the immediate thing that comes to mind is like men going into the woods for like a vision quest, right? Because like that's kind of the only thing we've somehow retained from our understanding, our collective understanding of what a rite of passage is. And of course, you and I have done this work of bringing back the sacredness of the inherent rites of passage women move through in relation to our wombs and our blood and bringing babies from the spirit realm to this earthly realm. But I think there's a lack of understanding and just a lost art of like when a rite of passage is needed. And you were speaking to that really beautifully on your Instagram stories a couple weeks ago or a week ago. And that's how I was like, okay, we need to get on and talk about this. And I also, before I forget, just want to name that we're recording this on Samhain, which feels so perfect. Yeah, so I think where I want to start is just, can you tell us, like tell the women listening or whoever is listening, there might be more than just women, about where rites of passage come from? Like, what is this? Where does this come from?
Yeah, before I begin, I just also want to honor my teachers and the guides who have been instrumental for me to put a framework to this knowing that I've had within my body for so long and something I've
Mhm.
tracked and experienced in my own lived experience, but in other women as well. And the first teacher, and I spoke to her in my last podcast episode, but one of my dear sisters and mentors, her name is Meadow. She was an instrumental guide for me in learning rites of passages and connecting to the feminine art of ceremony, as well as my dear sister Shira. So the two of them were like big teachers for me around ceremony and coming together around fire and returning to these ways. And then I also had the privilege of being able to take Rochelle Garcia's innate postpartum care training course. And in there, she wove in a lot of her framework of rites and passages and also the framework that she received from her studies. And so, what I'll be
Mm.
speaking to now kind of touches on those parts. And I'm a bit of a nerd in lots of different ways. And I also like love history. I love historical contexts in order to understand where we've come from and
Yeah,
so like as a guide for where we're going. So I'll be weaving all of that
I love that. I love that you're a nerd about things. That's one of my favorite parts of you.
in. Yeah, yeah. in this deeper process that I'm in, I'm learning how to just be innate feminine knowing that is so within the body. And I can't deny that I love learning, and I love finding out certain things that like, so yeah, so going back to kind of the historical framework, the term rite of passage itself is actually a term that was coined by this French he's an ethnophotographer. So he's kind of like an anthropologist, but would take pictures of different intact indigenous communities and peoples. And his name is Arnold. I think you wanted to say Andrew. Arnold Bon, and he's French, so it's like Guinep, but it's spelled Guinep. And he started to kind of track these rituals that were being done that kind of had this formula to them that he was seeing that would guide people through significant transformations in their life. And a lot of those transformations were rooted in physiological changes, as well as just spiritual and consciousness shifts that were happening. Kind of like the rite of passage was being done when someone was needing to go through a transformation, or they had been through some form of transformation that they felt like they needed to mark. The thing about his research that I find so important for us to consider, and something that Rochelle really emphasized in our training, is that the trajectory of a rite of passage is an initiation that one person or a group of people go through together, but it's still happening with the individual. But it's not done for just individual development or shifts. It's actually done from a collective framework. And it's done from a community framework, that as a community, we thrive and strive when we have individuals that are going through these significant changes, and that we as a community are supporting them through that, because we then all receive the benefit of being initiated peoples together. And when we're initiated peoples together, then we recognize that each of us come with a very unique gifts, and that we also receive different wisdom through the initiation itself that can sometimes have these universal themes and teachings, but that actually come through each of us in the uniqueness of who we are as a soul. And that when we return from the rite of passage, it's like we are returning this basket full of wisdom, these gifts to bring to our community. Say, listen, I learned this through my initiation, and now that I've learned this, I carry this wisdom and bring it so that we can all work together well, and each have our gifts that supports the ecosystem of our
community. Wow. Yeah. Okay. I want to just respond to some of that there. Thank you so much for sharing all of that context. It's really fascinating to me to track this thread specifically around that these rites of passage aren't just for the individual, because I think that sort of context around it is so different from our context in our modern society, where many of us are on a path to self-improvement, but it's self-improvement. And I think that there's this, I think it's emerging, this piece around community care. And that's something that I see happening in the collective a lot, is this return to like, how do we create community structures of care, and how do we, like re-village? There's a lot of talk of re-villaging. And so I love to have this context around, this is something that someone is doing, their own rite of passage, where they're like, I have been through this thing and I am different now and I have this wisdom. But then to take it that next step and be like, and this wisdom is going to serve my community. And I think that that's something that is really important for us to lean into in our modern society, because of all the ways that we've lost that and lost the like, what am I here to offer the community? And yeah, I've just been really kind of, I'm sure you have too, like tracking that sort of, what is the point really of our self-improvement work, of our, healing journeys, if we're not sharing that with others?
Yeah, and if you think about it as well, when we consider communal structures of living and existing, if one person felt that it was time for them to go through a rite of passage, they need to lean on other people to support that process.
Yeah.
And the reason why that can sometimes feel a little like, I can just go and like go to the mountains and go camping for 4 days and have a rite of passage and come back and go to my job and I'm fine. If you think about it, like that is rooted in a lot of our individualism framework in the modern world and for those in the globalized West. But it's also like we forget that like we are still relying on people because we are getting gas, which is like being extracted and pumped. And there are people that are part of that process. And maybe you did take some days off of work or you canceled some clients so you could go do that. And so you did rely on people. But if you think about it in that, framework, like if people are living in a village and someone's just like, peace, I'm gonna go, people are, what are you doing? Or what do you need help with? Or should I take care of the goats that you normally care for if you're going to work for 3 days? And so if you think about it, like it's not actually, it's not conducive to a village framework. And so most rites of passages are done with the calling in of communal support. Hey, I'm going through this. I need to do this. I'm going to need either you to hold these responsibilities so that I can kind of separate myself from the village to go through this process. But inevitably, I'm going to return back to the community. And I'm going to also be able to welcome back. And I think that segues perfectly into this, like the kind of formula that Arnold was really extrapolating from his observations, which looks different in different cultural contexts of these rituals, rites and passages. But basically, the rites of passage is held in kind of a structure of separation, transition, or the initiation, and then a reincorporation or welcome back. And if you think about it, it's kind of almost a birth process in and of itself. It's like the separation, the birth process, like return, like being placed back on its belly. And so if we think about also like all these different physiological frameworks of rites of passages, all of them really emerged out of the wisdom of these inherent cycles our bodies go.
Well, yeah, and I want you to keep going, but before I forget, it sounds also a lot like menstruation because, I think about the chambers of menstruation, the first chamber being separation. So there's that separation, there's that like, I'm changing, I'm different, things are shifting. And then there's like, most of us feel that like reemergence into the world post-menstruation. And if you're really like honoring it the way that we can and I think are meant to, you do feel different when you return to the world after menstruation.
I know, and I'm like separations, like literally my endometrium like separated from my uterine walls. Like I'm like, it is that process. Absolutely.
It is.
And the transition is like the moving of my blood through my cervix and zone of transformation. Yeah, it's like really, and I think that's such a poignant note to make. It's like all human ritual honestly emerged out of the meaning of human physiology. And the cycles of our bodies, which are inevitably also the cycles of Earth, that move and actually really like clear patterns that we can follow and track and attune ourselves to. And a lot of the rituals were basically like, oh, these cycles are happening inevitably. Let's celebrate them and honor them and kind of create celebration around them or some form of recognition that they're happening as a way to uplift them and as a way to also like when we keep the cycles moving, we need to, or when we honor the cycle that just happened, we meet the next cycle with a point of clarity and we harvest the medicine and the wisdom that we experience from others when we move on to the next. And we think about that even in our life cycles, if we celebrate our birthday, it's like we just think about birthdays like, yeah, this is my birthday, this is the day I was born. But it's like, yeah, it's the day that you were born. It's a huge day.
Yeah.
Some people will say like, oh yeah, it's your solar return, because in so many ways it is the exact placement of the sun in that constellation when we're born. It is that 365-degree rotational placement that we celebrate. And in that way, like a birthday can be a time to go through the acknowledgement. What did you go through this last solar cycle that brought you to this moment? What wisdom did you gather from that? What do you want to bring forward to the next one? So I love it. I'm like, birthdays are such a great way to acknowledge a rite of passage because it's inherent, it's there, it's obvious. And most people would say, like, yeah, I do feel a little bit different after my birthday. Or even if they think about it like a 10-year cycle, difference between 20 years old. It's a really big, not only physiological changes that happen in that time, but those are big psychological, emotional, and psycho-spiritual changes that happen in those cycles. And so when we can really celebrate them, then we experience coherence. Then we experience the honoring of all that we went through to arrive to this present.
Yeah. Yeah, so much in what you said. It's beautiful to think of birthdays like that because I think that's something that a lot of people can relate to. It's like, yeah, I have my birthday every year. And like you said, it's like, wow, the day you were born, like that's actually a huge deal. And I think the piece around like being witnessed and honored in what we've walked through, and then you sharing that the word coherence, that feels like the perfect word to really describe what these ceremonies can offer us. Because one of the things that one of my teachers in this sort of work is Nancy Lucina, and she shares that, rites of passage are marked, whether we consciously mark them or not. And so, on this podcast, I talk a lot about first period stories, like first bleed stories, menarche. And that moment is marked, like whatever happens at your first bleed, that's how you marked the rite of passage. And so it's not like we're making something up. It's like you're just making something that's more reverent for what's already happening. And that is what creates the coherence. And I mean, I can speak from experience of like the ceremony that we held for my birthday. It's like it does viscerally change you, like that day would have been marked, it would have been whatever. But I remember the reason that I even felt like, and this is something I want to get into, is the reason I asked for this to happen. And I think, in our modern society, we do sort of have to like make it happen for ourselves and seek our friends who know these ways. So I sought you, Madeline, and invited some of my other girlfriends who hadn't really done something like this before, but now they have that blueprint too. And I'm like, wow, I've been through a lot in this last year of my life. I left a marriage, my dog died, I moved to being nomadic. And then right before my birthday, I settled into my new home. And it's like all of a sudden, all these pieces, I was like, this all needs to be acknowledged. And it's so interesting because I think that's like an edgy thing for some of us to ask for in our society. And again, I received that blueprint from my teacher, Nancy, who shared that when she experiences something that she feels like is a rite of passage, she spoke to even her like mini drum broke. That was like her drum she carried around with her in her maiden years. Like after her son was born, her little drum broke. And she was like, I need ceremony for this. Like, I need to be acknowledged that I no longer need a little drum. I need a big drum that stays in my home because I'm staying in my home. And that stuck with me, it's these things that people say that stuck with us. And so when I had this moment of settling into my new home and looking back on my year, I was like, this needs to be acknowledged. And I think that's the first step is for anyone who's like feeling in that moment, I've been through something and I need for it to be acknowledged.
Or even I know I'm about to go through something and I feel like it's going to need to be acknowledged. And in
Yeah.
so many ways, it's like going through a rite of passage is being midwifed through a birthing process. It's saying, I know that something really big is going to move through me, out of as me. And can I have layers of support available to be my witness to acknowledge who I was before this time, who I am through going through this inevitable process of transformation, which is a mini death process. And then who's going to be on the other side of this rebirth saying, here we are, like we welcome you as this new expression of yourself, what you've gone through. And I feel like that's just so essential. And like you said, we do live in a time where sometimes we have to be the ones who are tracking our internal landscape. Wow, I feel like something really big is happening. Or, yeah, I know my birthday's coming up. And yeah, instead of a birthday party, I actually feel like I need to do a ceremony. So I'm gonna let people, this is what's changing in my landscape. Can you come tend my garden?
Mm.
celebrate the flowers that are in my garden from all that was composted.
Yeah, I mean, and it was the best birthday ever. That day was just like so I went and watched the sunset by myself after the ceremony, and it was just like my whole being was in full coherence and peace because I had been witnessed. And it's so interesting to track because maybe some people listening can relate to this for a while. And I sometimes still feel this, but after the rite of passage, it's a little quieter. There's just like a part of me that like really needed someone to tell me that they were proud of me. Like I was just like, I have walked through like such fire in the last year. Like I have done so many hard things and I've been so strong. And so a big part of the ceremony that we created for me was like having an opportunity for me to share like all of the things I did that were hard and have that be reflected back to me and like what my friends saw me through. And it's so interesting because we have this cultural overtone often in like the self-improvement individualist world of like, well, you validate yourself and you don't need anyone else's approval and whatever. And while I do get that, I think that we shouldn't rely on others' approval. Like there is like a primal part of us that wants someone to say like, hey, yeah, you did it. I see that you did that. I see that was hard and like look where you are now. And I think that's something most of us just like long for.
Yeah, and it's a real, like you said, it's very primal. It's a very strong need that we also desire as a small child. Like so many of us are the byproducts of like cry it out method and just like
Mm.
not as an infant, not getting our, not feeling like people understood what we're experiencing. So I think a lot of us are walking the world as like, yeah, like unhealed infants who want to get our needs met and want people to know, like, do you hear me? Do you hear what I'm saying? Do you see that I've gone through this change? Meet me in this. Because I think that's the other component of a rite of passage is it's like the acknowledgement that when we are going through something that's very transformative, it does change our internal landscape and it changes how we as individuals see the world. But sometimes if we're not letting people know what's changing inside of us, then the world or the people around us keep trying to meet us as who we were.
Yes.
That's where incoherence happens because we're realizing I feel so different, but you're trying to act like I'm still 15-year-old self, my 15-year-old
Oh, yeah, yeah.
self. And so the rite of passage is also a way of people being able to say, yeah, you saw that I went through this big change, or I'm returning back from this big change, something really big happened. And I'm letting you know so that you can meet me where I am. And so that I can walk through the world different and the world, I can walk through the world and the world can meet differently, the same way that I meet the world. It's new lens that I see it. Because it's the thing about a rite of passage is it pushes us to a state of an altered state of consciousness. It
Mm.
pushes us to that brink where we feel that we're meeting the edge of life and death, where our capacity to continue forward is sometimes thin because we're kind of pushed to these extremes and we're the veils are thin in a rite of passage. And
Mm.
when we return back, it's like that altered state of consciousness inevitably changes our perception, how we see things. And so it's almost like we're asking, can you see that I see things differently? And when the world and people around us are like, yeah, you look different or you feel different, or I don't know what the changes are, but I'm acknowledging that you're telling me that you feel changed. I'm here for it. I'm here for
Yeah.
how those changes express. So much coherence in the system
Yeah.
of the individual because it also means that we feel a sense of belonging and we feel welcomed by the community, knowing that they will receive us and who we are.
That's such an important piece to speak to. And while you're speaking to it, it actually brings up some grief for me, just thinking about how I know I myself have experienced this, and I'm sure you have, and people listening of like being met by people in your life who aren't willing to acknowledge the rite of passage that you've walked through, and just like how deeply that can really be felt in our bodies that need that acknowledgement like it's breath, like it's a basic need.
Yeah, and it's a big theme I think right now because these rites of passages and initiations are not so woven into a lot of cultures in the localized West in particular. Like we'll see it through like if you sometimes go to certain parts of India, you'll see rites of passages woven in and a lot of and I see the globalized West as in like the culturation of like Americanism, I would say, but like a lot of intact traditional indigenous communities and traditional communities here on these lands that they refer to as Turtle Island, that I think are Turtle Island, like there are intact rites of passages that are done and performed. And so I think like in the disease of like the Western civilization, it's like the lack of rites of passages and initiations that are done. And I think we're seeing it both in like young adults who are feeling like, you don't understand me. Like I'm thinking about like, you don't understand me. But then there's also like older people who are just aging, but they're not aging into becoming elders. We lack a lot of elders. And that's in the whole revillaging conversations of where are the elders? Like the elders are old people right now who didn't go through initiations. But
Yeah.
the difference between an older and an elder, I feel, is like a human who has been held through their initiations and gone through rites of passages so that they can show up in elderhood with carrying wisdom.
Mm.
And what makes also like somebody who's like a young elder, like someone who's walking a medicine path, is someone who acknowledges that they need rites of passages, or they enact or invite in or call in support to go through a rite of passage. Because so many of us lack that now, we also have to kind of like make up for lost time.
Mm.
Like the rites of passages that we go through
Yeah.
sometimes are like tending to the lack of rites of passages that we have. Like
Yeah.
it's why I think childbirth is so transformative for a
Mm.
lot of women nowadays because it blasts them open from a place of like that was the massive rite of passage that like just ended up kind of like a dryer, like it like pulled in all the other ones so they can like all happen at once. And it's almost like we're like rites of passage constipated.
Yeah. Well, and like birth is like a huge, like you can't ignore that one.
Cannot ignore it. So all that hasn't been done, all the initiations that haven't happened just get caught up into it
Mm.
once. And,
Yeah.
and whether we choose to do that before we give birth as women or not, but like I do feel like even as you're speaking, I'm like, yeah, this birthday one was. It feels like it had these poignant um, threads for you that were like catching up from.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. I mean, in teenage Natalie, like, so needed to be seen and didn't really get that. And I want to talk about that ceremony, but I also want to just speak to what you said about birth being this like catch up rite of passage. And, on this podcast, that's why, like, I ask women about their first bleed. And then if they have birth stories, we go into that. And it's like often I can track and they can track that there's these similar themes that show up in their birth that they met at Menarche, and themes that weren't healed, that weren't like seen and witnessed and honored, like a fear imprint that you receive your first bleed and there's some fear, and then in turn later you have fear going into your birth, and it's like, oh my gosh, like we're meeting these same themes because they weren't acknowledged in the beginning. And that's why I think it's so important to start with the first bleed and be like, okay, like what was that like for you? And one of the things that I love to offer at the retreats that I do is something I learned from, again, my mentor, Nancy, which is the Menarche Reclamation Ceremony. And I think that's a really beautiful way for women to start. If there's like someone hosting that local to you, like if you want to come on my retreat, like we do that work because it's so important to acknowledge and re-imprint the first bleed, because most of us picked up imprints that we just haven't healed yet, or like we didn't have that moment acknowledged. But what you said is like you can actually go back and do that work.
Yeah, coherence is always available to us, and the parts of ourselves that are trapped in a state of coherence are often those that are fractured because there wasn't embracing of the fullness of an experience. And so anytime you actually invite in wholeness or call back those parts of yourself, it's almost like it's like a puzzle piece, like when you're doing these reclamation ceremonies, you're calling back a puzzle piece to yourself and you're putting it in place, and it does have ripple effects forwards and backwards.
Yeah.
That's what the gift of also like modern rites of passages can offer us, especially for those of us who were raised in a cultural paradigm that didn't hold this framework, that when we do feel like we have availability to receive this guidance and to be held through a rite of passage, it can actually be deeply coherent for wholeness and allow us to be more present in our life and approach to move forward in our life from that place.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that, it's hard to stop going, but I just have to say, like,
Yeah.
it's obvious that it can be obvious to track what happens when we don't do that, because we live in a world where some people are stuck in a state of ignorance, or are like stuck and reminiscing about past things that happened, and it feels unresolved and it's bogging them down. Like I was recently holding a circle for those who've experienced pregnancy and infant loss. And there was a woman who came in her 60s, and I was holding space for her to process the death of her son. And it was so poignant to be present with her as she was time traveling back, and we were meeting the choices that she made when she was a young early mother to who she is now. And I could just see in her eyes this, like, it was like all the parts behind her. Some people aren't listening, but I'm like, my hands are behind me. But it's like, if you think about, like, if you close your eyes and if you think about all the past versions of yourself kind of standing behind you by year, it's like, I have my 32-year-old self, my 31-year-old self. It's just like 5 years there, there's like one version behind you. And it's like, if you think about like your 6-year-old self who didn't experience that rite of passage, being able to receive that and just like touches all of those parts of yourself up, and then you can see it in somebody's eyes, and they're not trapped in that.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. And I think it is important to go back and do that, whether it's like you're consciously, it's not like you need to go back and like re-imprint every year of your life, but to allow a rite of passage to do that catching up work is so important, because I think going back to the elder thing, it's like, often we see older women who are still, and I say this with so much love, but like still acting like a maiden. Like they haven't really even made the transition from maiden to mother, so mother to elder isn't available to them either. And it's really interesting to just track that that's something and I mean, this is a whole other topic that we don't have time to get into, but the topic of like aging and the like not allowing ourselves to age. I was actually just talking to my mother about that yesterday. We were listening to a Madonna song, and she was like, "Have you seen what Madonna looks like now?" And I was like, "No, I don't think I ever knew what Madonna looks like, actually." And so first she shows me a picture of Madonna, when she was younger, probably in her 20s, like recording music. And then she showed a picture of Madonna now. And for those of you who also don't know what Madonna looks like, she's gotten a lot of plastic surgery. And it actually sparked a really interesting conversation between my mom and I about like, yeah, why don't we just let ourselves age? And what is that sort of lack of holding of the rite of passage of aging and not seeing that as beautiful? Because personally, when I see an elder with like gray hair and wrinkles in her face, and there's usually that light in the eyes, I'm like, she's beautiful. But you have to do some unlearning of the standard programming to see that. And I think rites of passage work is part of how we come back to that natural process of moving from one phase to the next.
Yeah, and I think about it, I'm like, so many women don't have like a rite of passage ceremony to acknowledge menopause.
Oh my
There's
gosh,
so
I
many
need
women
that.
struggling through menopause. And I'm like, actually, it would be so much more, like, I would be curious what would unfold in people's
Mm,
lives and what would be unfolding in women's experience through menopause if that was held as like a
mm.
more of a rite of passage container.
Yeah, we need that. That's like the next frontier is like we're getting back to honoring our bleeding bodies and we're getting back to honoring birth, but the frontier of honoring menopause is like very new and uncharted territory. Yeah.
Yeah, like you said, it can't happen without also like a massive cultural paradigm because it also comes with this idea of like, yeah, re-embracing aging and also learning how to be with the process of death as well. Like we live in a death averse culture, which I think is also shows why there's also sometimes a rites of passage aversion as well, because it's like, yeah, I mean, you and I are like, yeah, when's the next rite of passage? But we think about people who are like, I'll be honest, after I went through two really significant rites of passages in the past 2 years, I spoke to my mom who was going through, at that time was going through a separation divorce process to my dad. And I said, she was kind of at the end of my marriage ceremony, she and I got on a phone call. She said, how did you do that? What did you, how did you learn how to do ceremony? Or what is a rite of passage? Or I didn't know that like that could be a wedding like that. Or, she just kind of was posing these questions.
Wow.
And as I was starting to explain to her rites of passage, I said, you've been through a rite of passage. And, I'm here as your guide if you would like support honoring this massive uncoupling experience while also still being with the father, like being in correlation to the father of your children.
Mm.
And I could hear in her voice this hesitation. She was like,
Yeah.
how would you know when I'm ready for that? And it was a really fascinating moment for me to feel like, oh, actually, we sometimes are the minority of the ones who are like, oh yeah, like let's plan another rite of passage. And then actually it can feel, and maybe for those who are listening, it may feel a little nervous. Like, hey, what
Mm.
does that entail? Or that sounds really scary. Because
Yeah.
in truth, the rite of passage is the honor of a small death process.
Yeah.
It is like really the structure that Arnold kind of wrote out, but at the same time that you see as you track other different rituals that are enacted in intact cultures, is this really acknowledging who you are, who you once were, and who you will become. And in order to go from who you once were to who you will become, there is a small death. There
Yeah.
is a shedding. There's something in you that has to like completely alchemize. And I think about the caterpillar and the butterfly. It's like,
Mm.
in order for a caterpillar to become a butterfly, it must go into a chrysalis and completely dissolve. And like in its dissolving process, it literally turns into mush. And but it's through that mush that the imaginal cells are available for the butterfly to complete. And
Mm.
that's the rite of passage, is that you can't just be like, okay, this is who I once was and this is who I'll become. And I don't want to go through the mush process. Like a caterpillar with wings, and I don't think you'll fly very well. It's like there really does have to be the mush process. And when there's the mush, that's when we meet our edge. And that can be scary. And that's when, like, going back to that, those, when we think of rites of passage, we think about men going to vision quests. Like those vision quests often are like 5-day long ceremonies when men go on an isolated part of a mountain and they fast from food and water for that whole time. And what ends up happening is the body is physically pushed to a level of dehydration and starvation. And when we meet those levels, it's when we push our physical body in that way, what ends up happening is that we have like a psychological change as well. We're pushed on our psychological edge and our spiritual edge. And what I like to say is it's there that we got to, it's
Mm.
there that we feel ourselves merge so much with the ever present energy of all that is. And it's when we meet God in that way and we feel ourselves go into that massively expanded state of merging with everything that
Mm,
we feel ourselves as everything, but we also feel we are as the part of
mm,
everything. We know who we are as the part of everything. And then we end up come back into ourselves. The men come down from the mountain, they receive water, receive nourishment. Then they themselves see their vessel, their form, their voice as a channel for not just
mm.
all that is and for God, but the uniqueness of how they bring the voice of God forward and how they embody these universal principles, how they embody love into form.
As you're speaking about that, I'm like, I've heard you say before that like not honoring these rites of passage is why our society is so sick and our culture is, struggling. We're struggling. And as you're speaking that, I'm like, yeah, like if we had, you and I have spoken a lot to the rites of passage of women, but if we had the men honoring their rites of passage, like, wow, I just feel that the men in our society right now are really confused about their place in the world. That's something I've noticed. There's like a lot of confusion or a feeling of like not knowing how to show up, or like, there's all this talk of toxic masculinity. So the men are like, well, how do I be masculine and not toxic? And like this rites of passage work and like allowing them to come into their hearts, like that just feels like that's the answer.
And I feel like it's why a lot of people seek out plant medicine ceremonies.
Yeah,
They
so
get
true.
involved too. And I feel like it's also why some people get, I wouldn't take it so far to say addicted, but they feel as though they need to do so many of those because it
Yeah.
does bring us to a similar place that the rite of passage does. But I'll definitely say I've been able to really track the difference between men who are like constantly in plant medicine ceremonies and like the men who have embarked on true intact rituals of rites of passages. And it's a very different frequency of a
Yeah.
type of person. And I'm
Yeah.
not like dismissing or putting down plant medicine ceremonies. I just feel as though like it's important that we recognize that like we are plant medicine and it's
Yeah.
important to realize that like our bodies can go through these rites of passages whether we have a substance that takes us there or not, and that a rite of passage really could just be as simple as a birthday celebration, could be as important as like someone going through like a deep physical experience that makes them feel like they have a near death experience
Yeah.
and return back to their.
Yeah, yeah, I so feel you. And I want to speak a little bit to, yeah, kind of my experience with a rite of passage and something you spoke to earlier about the fear of the like, what is this going to be? Like, am I ready for this? That like, because yeah, like, I am like you in the sense that I was so excited for my birthday rite of passage, but I wasn't ready until I was ready, if you know what I mean. Like, I had the idea that I wanted this rite of passage of like months before I was like, okay, now it's time. Because acknowledging for me, I guess I'll just get really specific and say for me, a lot of the rite of passage, it wasn't like completely tied to my ex-partner, but a lot of it, the transformation was initiated by that uncoupling process. Because that, like you spoke to with your mom, that's like a massive transformation of being with someone to like totally separating and figuring out a new way of being and walking through things. And I think for me, acknowledging the rite of passage was a little scary because it meant, yeah, I am not with this person anymore. Like that, I'm fully closing that. Like I'm fully putting both feet into this new me that I already have become, to be honest. Like I kind of had already stepped into that in my day-to-day life, but I hadn't marked it. And the marking it felt quite scary and intimidating for me in that moment because it meant it was real. And I think a lot of people can relate to that. It's like, wow, okay, like, am I really going to acknowledge that I'm letting go of this old thing? Even if you knew that that's what you wanted to let go of, even if you know it's the right move, it's like, it's a big thing to do. And so I just want to really, yeah, hold compassion for those who are listening and maybe have that like pit in their stomach of like, oh, I don't know if I can do that. And like knowing that that's actually probably the call to the rite of passage. And yeah, and so that kind of was my call. And it took me a couple of months to be like, I'm ready for this. And then it took Madeline saying like, I would love to support you in this. And then it took sending a few personalized messages to some sisters and saying like, this is a big ask for me, but like I want you to show up for me and I really need this and I want to do it on my birthday and yeah, I think I just want to speak to that ceremony a little bit to give people some context of like how this can look. So like I said, I moved to this uncoupling. I had this big initiation of my dog passing away while I was traveling nomadically through Peru the day before I led my first retreat. And all of that kind of together just like totally cracked my heart open and helped me to become this new version of myself who is softer. And that's kind of was my intention of the ceremony to really mark the place I went from being in a place of struggle and challenge and striving. Not that any of those things are inherently wrong, but I had moved to a place of softness in my heart and a place of feeling like a more embodied and more mature version of myself. And like Madeline said, I think part of this has like ripples that went back into like my teenage years too, of like, yeah, like all of these things that I wanted to be witnessed in, all the changes I've made in who I was. And so the way that we created this rite of passage ceremony was a lot of like me dreaming into it, and I used my monthly rite of passage of my bleed to like fully receive what I needed that to be. And I think it's really important here to have someone who can help hold that with you, so that you can kind of speak your visions and you can have someone put it into a structure for you. And that's what Madeline really offered me, which was so beautiful. I just got to speak to like, this is what I've walked through. And so I shared kind of what I just shared here about moving from struggle to softness, we could say. And then it was like, I really need to be witnessed in this. Like that was the biggest thing for me going into this was like, I need to be seen. I need to be acknowledged in what I've walked through. I need those in my life to see that like I have been through this big thing and I did it and I'm different now. And I needed that to be marked. And so a big part of the ceremony was like, setting this altar, and the women, Madeline and my friends, weaved this threshold in the water for me of flowers and mugwort that I could cross. And so the first part was being on this one side of the threshold where the water was like quite rocky and ripply, which was so sweet. That perfect symbolism that the river offered us. And then I had an opportunity on that side of the river to speak. And for me, it needed to be to speak as long as I needed to about my experience. And I think that's really key, is having that deep space held for you to really get it out, because you might not know what's going to come out in that moment, and active listening. And so after that, I actually included a ritual that for me had been something I'd imagined in my head, in my imaginal realms for some time, which was the sacred spring where women go to cleanse themselves, and women use vessels of water to pour water over their heads. And so before I crossed the threshold moment, my friends were able to share what they had witnessed in me, which was, I could just like cry thinking about that moment. It was so special. It was so special to hear all of their unique reflections. And I think just like to have other people like see parts of you that maybe you hadn't put words to yourself, and to see your magic in the moments when you're like, you've been so in it that maybe you haven't seen the immensity that you've moved through. I just think that like we all deserve that. And I feel so, just like so absolutely blessed to have had that. And so the women poured water on me and held my hands as I crossed the thresholds and listened to me as I spoke my intentions for this next year of my life, and threw out flower petals for them. And then we sung and then we feasted. And it was like the most, I wish a birthday like that for everyone. And I just want to say, like, if it feels scary to do something like that, like, the thought of it is so much scarier than the actual ceremony, because once you're in it, there's like this liberation that comes from moving through that transition. And for me, it was the water and the crossing the threshold. And then once you're in the celebration, it's like, thank goddess. Like, thank goddess we just did that. Like, my being feels more at ease. Ah, and so I really wanted to speak to the details of that ceremony so that anyone listening can like get a feel for how they can use their unique circumstances to craft something that can be as simple or as elaborate as they want it to be. And you don't need to necessarily like go to Peru to ayahuasca to, you can. I think that's great. But like you can go to the creek with your girlfriends on your birthday and have a really profound experience. And especially if you have a friend like Madeline. Yeah.
Love listening to you, even in this harvest component. Because right now you are in so many ways, you're still in an integrative state from this rite of passage. And I feel like it's an integration where we can receive also those really sweet moments of harvesting and
Mm.
reflecting back on like, yeah, where were those moments that felt so poignant? And what you were speaking to is like, I just kept feeling the metaphor here, like if we can become mirrors for each other to reflect back, like you said, those parts that we can even fully ourselves or that we couldn't even see that was happening. So we're in the thick of it. It is hard. And those to receive an accurate reflection from somebody who knows you, loves you, trusts your process is so deeply healing and necessary.
Yeah.
like you said, everybody deserves that.
My intention with the Moon Baby Magic podcast has always been that it feels like a safe sanctuary for women's stories. The kind of stories that we used to sit around the fire and share with each other, the kind of stories that came from honoring rites of passage and having the circle of sisters feel strong. If you've ever craved that level of community but haven't quite found it in person, I want you to know that the next Nourished and Thriving retreat is coming up, and this is exactly the place for women like you. On the twin volcano island of Ometepe, rising from the sacred waters of Lake Coquibolca of Nicaragua, we gather for 8 days of women-centered activities, like adventuring to tropical waterfalls, self-love, powerful photo sessions, silent mornings with bone broth cacao, daily women's well-being, health, womb, and expansion workshops, and mouth-watering, deeply nourishing seed oil-free international dishes made with grass-fed local meat, fruits, vegetables, and raw dairy. 7 nights of singing, story sharing, and heart-to-heart conversations around a crackling fire on the beach, while connecting with like-hearted women as the stars twinkle above and we sip even more bone broth hot chocolate. Laura and I hosted the first Nourished and Thriving retreat this past spring, in the Sacred Valley of Peru, and it was amazing. The women healed, they learned new things about themselves, they learned about their bodies, they came home to their cycles, they made friends with each other, and have continued to connect and reap the benefits of giving this gift to themselves. The Nourished and Thriving retreat is happening next time, March 30th to April 6th, 2026, this time in beautiful Nicaragua, and we want you to join us. The pre-sale pricing is live until November 15th, so you can get the lowest price ever then. And yes, of course, there are payment plans available and a connection call to chat with us for free to make sure that this is the right fit for you. There are women already claiming their spots, and we hope that you're next. So you can find all the details in the show notes. Yeah. Yeah, and that's just like one example of a rite of passage, and there's like so many ways. I know you've spoken a little bit to kind of both. I know that you've been through two really massive rites of passage, one being your union ceremony and the other being your birth experience. And I wonder like what you want to share about. Those are both immense topics. So I'm just kind of like, where do you want to begin with that? Because the way that you've gone about those things, I think is clear by even your mother's response that like that's a blueprint for people and people are noticing and people are saying, what is this? So how did you craft those rites of passage for yourself? And I'm also curious, like, were you held? Do you feel like you had someone to hold you through that? Or do you feel like as someone who's actively bringing these ways back, like you kind of have to hold yourself a little bit?
Good question. It was a both and. I would say that my union ceremony was an initiation in and of itself for me to actualize, because I had been doing like smaller versions or acknowledging like smaller little ceremonies of transformations. But when it really clicked for me that like our idea of what a wedding is actually like a very modern portrayal of a traditional rite of passage ceremony, Once
Mm.
that clicked, then I felt like I really started to understand the framework. And Meadow was actually a very big part of that for me, because we had also asked her to officiate our ceremony. And so in officiating, it felt like we really needed her to
Mm.
understand the framework that was coming to me as like a clarity of like, oh, this is the design basically that I felt like was showing itself, that wanted to be expressed or shown, or wanted to be not even shown, experienced. And so it was really special to be able to be held by her in that way. And that, yeah, that was a beautiful time, because also we have our ideas of like what weddings look like. And so it's kind of like take elements of that design, but then also shift it in terms of what I felt like was kind of coming up for me. So for me, that, and I had said this on the other podcast, but that marriage ceremony, that 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 ceremony as an acknowledgement of a rite of passage was for me the rite of passage of preparing us to become parents, because we were so clear about our timeline, our intention from conception. So that felt like it was the beginning portion of like stepping from both being like bachelor and bachelorette, we use modern terms, or like, yes, we had already been in partnership, felt this commitment to each other, but stepping into union in that way was the acknowledgement of embracing husband and wife, but also like seeing each other and meeting each other as preparing for a mother and father. And so for me, going into my pregnancy, I could feel like the waves of that rite of passage continuing to work itself through in me. And when I did experience my miscarriage, I was really touched by how much the foundation of that rite of passage from our union ceremony directly supported my capacity to embrace myself still as a mother, and embrace my partner, husband, as a father, because so rarely is that acknowledged in our cultural context. Like, so where they're like, oh, well, you're not really a mom until like you're holding your baby. Like, even today, a woman who I'm supporting asked about joining a mother's writing circle, and she's like, well, I'm still pregnant, so I feel like it's imposter syndrome. And I was like,
Whoa.
you're a mother because you're pregnant.
Yeah.
You're gestating a human being inside of your body. You're a mother. And that starts from like, I feel like, some fertilization, implantation, early pregnancy.
Yeah.
And then no matter how that pregnancy unfolds, it is a rite of passage, because it is such a physiological rite of passage as well, because it's like literally the parts, like the mother's body is completely changing. I mean, imaginal cells are happening as a baby is gestating in the body, and her cells are transforming into maternal cells, and there's so much transformation that happens. And what I really harvested and learned from my experience too is the rites of passage framework for those who experience miscarriage, and even for when I work with women that move through abortion or intentional pregnancy release. There is that like, oh, I'm not able to claim mother, or this isn't real motherhood in that way. And the rite of passage helps to acknowledge that. Yes, you really did go through this change, and you are a different person now. However, you want to either claim motherhood or not, you can find another title that feels like, some people say, I'm a lost mom. It's like, that's an identity shift, and even in itself. But also the framework of that rite of passage, like I spoke to, it's like we're touching death, we're touching transformation. And so the fine of the rite of passage framework is ever more important for miscarriages and pregnancy because of truth and stillbirths as well. Early births is like, you need to touch that death threshold. And so it's really important to have the framework of a rite of passage to acknowledge, like, as a woman that has carried both life and death in her womb, like I went through that death part of the rite of passage in my physical body. I drew death in my body, and that forever changed. meeting that threshold of life and death in that specific way forever changed. After my own experience, I really started to see how much more important it was to craft and curate these rites of passages for women after they've experienced any form of death and loss through a pregnancy experience, whether that be not intentional or intentional, because I started to see the big changes that happened afterwards to meet them on the other side of that. And it doesn't, I think it's important to name that, and having the lived experience of this is important. This doesn't negate the grief too. Like, this, a rite of passage isn't just to make you feel better. It's like,
So true.
it's not like you're gonna do the rite of passage and you're like, wow, I don't have grief anymore. I feel so amazing. It's like, actually, it allows you to be in coherence, which is, when we're in coherence, it means that we get to feel things in the present moment, and we get to meet them in the present moment and integrate them and experience them and express them. And that's the gift of the rite of passage, is that. So for me, I really felt that as I was going through the process of encouraging my body to birth. And then in my postpartum, I felt that really significant call. This is where the passages has happened. And every time I would sit in meditation, I felt like my ancestors saying, you have to be witnessed. You have to to complete the rite of passage, you have to be witnessed. And it was, and I spoke to this earlier and named it, like, the fear arose. How selfish of me to just call everybody over to my house and say, hey, come be with me to celebrate that I had a miscarriage. Like that came up, and I was like, oh God, that is nervous to do that. And there's also the nervousness comes from being the way shower, being the one that's choosing that path. And I did have friends who said, like, can I support you in this? And I did have layers of support, but because this one in particular felt so much part of my medicine and like what I'm to do for others, I held a lot of ceremonial component because it felt like I was doing something on some other level, on multiple other levels that I even to this day can't fully articulate, because it happened that way. But I was held through having it be a potluck, and my dad came a little bit early and helped bring chairs down so that some of the folks who couldn't sit on the ground in the forest where we helped this rite of passage were able to sit on chairs. And then he helped us put all those chairs away. And there were these different, like my friend Cyrus, he was like, oh, I'd love to cleanse the space. Get started. Great. I can't cleanse and do all the things. Like he did a ceremonial cleansing, and there were just these layers that started to emerge from it. But what I really experienced from that was the potency of really being witnessed, especially in a process of a motherhood and fatherhood process. We didn't have our baby to present, to say, like, look, we went through this. We are mother and father now because we have this baby. It's like, we are mother and father. We cannot have our baby in this physical form to show that to you, to prove it to you. And so we're actually asking you to, again, learn our place. Like, we're meeting the world as mother and father, us as mother and father. And that's the vulnerable place. And and everyone said yes. And that's the beauty of calling this in. It's it actually encourages people to say yes to these life changes and to invite experience for all of us. But that was also a rite of passage for my parents, in this version that we are. And how beautiful it is that we as a community, as a family, now we all are showing up different now that we're changed by our individual.
Wow. I mean, it's just the way that you are, like, when you said it's something that you can't even describe yet, I just felt like your daughter working through you with like her medicine that she has to share for the world, of like we need to bring these ways back of like, you are this person who is able to show the way, like you said, to be a way shower for how we can honor these experiences. Because without honoring them, like I just imagine if you hadn't acknowledged that for yourself, like what sort of pieces would have been left I don't even want to say unhealed because it's not like we're ever fully healed from anything. But the parts of you that wouldn't, right? The parts of you that would feel less intact. I think it brings a sense of intactness to honor these rites of passage and like fully call your mother self in and not have these moments of like, am I not? How do I relate to the world now? To just fully claim that for yourself. And the way that you've done it has been absolutely inspiring because what you've done is you've moved past the edginess of asking for the witnessing and you've moved into a place of like showing how deeply we can honor each rite of passage and how deeply worthy, again, that piece of like what we deserve and what we're worthy of having ourselves be fully witnessed and honored. And I mean, I think earlier this month I had Lindsay Kersell on my podcast, and she spoke to her abortion when she was a teenager and how that played out in like her years of her 20s until she got pregnant. And then she was like, oh my God, I never acknowledged this. Like, I never acknowledged that rite of passage. And so I think the more that we can acknowledge every single experience we have of touching motherhood for however many weeks that might be, it's like we're just going to keep healing and we're going to keep creating wholeness and intactness in our systems and in our communities. And one thing I particularly love about your story is you called upon your community to witness you, and then you cut your hair.
Well, and that thanks for reminding me about that because I was gonna name like that ceremony felt so good and so beautiful for me for the people that knew me. But then I would go to the farmer's market and
Yeah.
oh my God, the farmer's market was a really brutal experience because I had told people there that I was pregnant. And then I showed up at the farmer's market, having not been there for a few weeks because I honored my postpartum as in I did a full one and then I don't want to say I isolated, but I held that as a sacred window. And so I didn't leave my home. And so when I did emerge back in and I went to the farmer's market, oh, that was like such a tough time because I would,
Mm.
and I'm just naming this reality for those who've experienced it, but like I would see people look at me and then look down at my belly and then look at my eyes and like look at my side, like looking for my bigger belly or my baby. It was
Mm.
really tricky. And I noticed, I was like, wow, this is also a fascinating point of how we do these modern these rites of passages in our modern cultural context, because also if you think about it, the cultural contexts where these emerge, it was like many communities and villages living amongst one another, and the idea of somebody kind of going through something that big and not everyone really knowing this was less. But in
Yeah.
like smaller and like in city structures that we have nowadays where there's many people living in certain communities, we can have people go through big life experiences and people not know about them.
Yeah.
And so what I was tracking is I was like, oh wow, I was still kind of having these like micro doses of the confusion of feeling other people wondering what happened. I
Mm.
was like, you know what? I feel like I need to do something so that even if I don't have to explain to people what happened, they can just see that something's different about me. And again, not because I need external validation, it's just because I felt like I was meeting the world differently and the world, some parts of the world were not meeting me.
And you need that coherence.
Yeah. And so I was like, you know what? I'm going to cut my hair.
Yeah.
And I said this on the other podcast, but I'll say it again. Every time people would say to me, wow, you cut your hair, was as if they were saying you had your baby, which
Oh,
is such an interesting, like, and I didn't even make that up. It just happened like 3 times. And literally they would say it, my body would be like, yeah. It's like,
that's so good.
whoa. And Natalie and I had talked about this before, but like there are also traditional cultures where people will do some sort of physical marking or change their physical form as a part of that rite of passage. So whether
Yeah.
it's a piercing or a tattoo or a burn or something to acknowledge like you've been through that. And in that way, like we think about, especially with tattoos, cultures that tattooed their face in particular was a really clear way of, if they interacted with another tribe, if a tribe member saw that they had a certain tattoo, it's like, oh, you've been through that. You've done that. You're a warrior because you went through X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
And how that is a way that we let people know my internal landscape has changed, so I changed my external landscape so that the world can receive that change.
Yeah, and I think that that's a way that we can bring this modern or bring the ancient into the modern of like, I think as you were speaking, I was thinking of all these ways that we actually do that in our culture, one being wedding bands. So wedding bands is a great example of like you're showing that you're different. You are in union now. The other one is like the stereotypical breakup haircut, which I always have been like, that's great. Like girls should cut their hair after they go through a breakup, like help you feel new, help you feel fresh. Like ancient cultures knew that hair carried memory and wisdom. And so cutting our hair, it's like, this is a new beginning for me. I am different now. And that's an obvious change. And I even joked, I'm like, I'm like, maybe I need to get a tattoo to acknowledge my own rite of passage. And I also just want to say the farmers market thing is so fascinating because that's a community where it's like you see these people often, but they're not necessarily your like close village type people. And on a totally more minor level than your experience, when I got back to Ojai after being away for 2 years and going through my massive transformation and uncoupling and all of the things, I walked to where I used to buy carrots. And it was, first of all, a trip for me to go back to the farmer's market after 2 years. And I walked to the carrots, and the woman selling the carrots like jerked her gaze up at me and she goes, well, I haven't seen you in a while. And like that was it, And I was just like, yeah, but there's so much more than that. I'm not who you used to see. It's like, and so I think, when we think about how to really honor these rites of passage in a modern context, I think things like cutting your hair, having a new piece of jewelry that is like really obvious statement, like getting a tattoo, like something that about, to have that experience like you had, where when someone says something about your new appearance, it can give you that sense of like, oh, I'm being acknowledged as new. And to know that that isn't like a you're seeking external validation thing. That's just, again, a primal desire.
Yeah, I'm thinking about one of my dear friends who received a tattoo in honor of her daughter that died after her birth, and how it's also a way where people can say, oh, I really like your tattoo, and she'll say, thanks, this is the tattoo honoring my daughter. And
Yeah.
then it's like those micro moments of honor that continues. Oh, when I look at this, I think of my daughter. When people ask me, she's here. And it's like it also supports to like keep the light alive, to honor those points that make us who we are, but also change us so we can be this present version of ourselves. And yeah, I mean, and on the note of like, how do we do this in modern ways? It's like, yeah, there's those things that we can do after, but then also like when it comes to the process of designing and curating, like Natalie said, like you felt the call to have that invitation, and through a series of connections, it came into form. And it can really be, it can look so different. And I think that's why I love rites of passages, is that this formula is actually very adaptable to many different ways. And it could really just be like a 5-minute thing, or it could be a 5-hour, 5-day ceremony. Like it really could be small or large or however it needs to be. But the one thing that I feel like I always want to fight for is the into the revelation that you don't have to do this by yourself. And that like the beauty of what supports coherence from the passages is the container, is those who can offer accurate reflection, is inviting people who once were and have seen you through the change, or have some sort of semblance of understanding there's something that's changed, and are down to like show up for you as this changed version of yourself. And that's important. And it could be as simple as 3 people, or it could be as big as 300 people, and it could just, that's the gift that we have this time right now, is that we actually, yes, we're inundated with information, and that can also look like modern day information that we have, but also anthropological records of certain traditional cultures. But we also have many traditional cultures and peoples that are still alive and thriving well today, that we also can look to and ask for guidance from. But also, we have the capacity to dream into something, and we can utilize this formula and this layout as an opportunity to kind of plug in what we're. Are you someone who's never done a rite of passage in your whole life, and this is a rite of passage for you to just catch up on them? That might look a little bit different in how someone plugs in information. Or are you not feeling like you need to catch up on all of them, but you really need someone to acknowledge, and you need to be acknowledged in this shift in your space? And now that's what it can be. And it can weave in certain little ritual moments, like you had said, Natalie, like, I've always had this vision of women pouring water over my head. Well, then let's do it. Let's make that be part of it. For me, for our union ceremony, I had the vision of a blue and I wrapped together, together to like symbolize and embody this tapestry of our ancestry that felt like we were the threads of woven. And so we did. Had our friend wrap us with this fabric from my husband's ancestral lands. Wow. And it was like such a cool moment. And I'm sure you know this, but like to have thought like this would be so beautiful. I keep feeling like this needs to happen. And then to be there and to do it and to be witness doing it is like, oh my gosh, it's happening in this time, because it feels so good. And yeah, this is marking it for me to read this.
Yeah. That's exactly, and I mean, that's the thing of like rites of passage are marked. And so we choose how to mark them. And if we don't choose, something will mark them. So we might as well choose to mark them in the way that feels intact and complete and beautiful to us.
Yeah, I think as you're saying that, I just want to hit on this quick little note that comes up for me too. It's like you had mentioned in your studies that the rites of passages will happen whether we do something for it or not. Like, it's happening. But I also think that our bodies will try to make something, I don't want to say bigger than what it is, but like we'll try to enact some form of putting us in a situation where we have to acknowledge that something has changed.
Yeah.
Like I kind of shared, like I had this gastrointestinal virus at the time when I would have been given birth, had my timeline forward. And that was like, hey, my body was like, we're going through another version of this rite of passage, and we're going to physically go through it. And it was a humble reminder of, oh, wow, like I thought I was putting things in place to honor this time, but my body really did a very big physical reaction of that. And so I even had spoken to this, and my aunt has breast cancer. She was like, wow, I wonder what my breast cancer was wanting to express as something that's like this big change that's in my life. Because yeah, she had this physical cancer, but it also changed her perception of how she sees the world and brought her closer to her heart and her gratitude for life. And so it's like the rite of passage, it will be there. It's not like we have to seek it out.
Yes. Oh, I love that. I love that. Yeah, it's going to happen. And so just bringing like conscious awareness to it is such a beautiful gift that we can give to ourselves and to our communities, to bring it back full circle to that piece around like this is not just self-improvement work. This is like community building work.
I also, we talked about the nervousness. Like I know what it's like to feel that, well, where do I even go? And so just naming that that's also part of my work. That's what I do. Like supporting Natalie in this experience for her birthday I was like, this is what I do. I'd love to do this as a friend. But if anybody is curious and wants to dialogue and wants to feel what it's like to be supported in the guidance of how to craft and build their own rite of passage for what they need in their life, I'm available. Reach out to
Yeah.
me because I love it. It actually like lights me up so much. And we had a call last week with a 67-year-old woman. It's like, okay, I think I want to write a passage. Can we talk about this? And we came through in these beautiful details. Oh, this kind of food will be there. Oh, what if the threshold is made out of this branch of this tree that looks like a placenta? And it's like, because again, we are not doing this by ourselves, and we're re-envisioning this into the world. So it lights me up to meet people and bringing these visions to life and to curate these rites and passages that we all absolutely deserve.
Yeah, thank you so deeply for your work, Madeline. It's just like the most important thing. It's so important. It's so needed. Like we need the people bringing back these ways. And yeah, I'm just really grateful that you are one of those people and so grateful to have you in my life, like specifically too.
You spoke to this, that you're doing this in the retreat work as well.
Mhm.
For those women who are specifically feeling like they need, support in the rites of passages of their own feminine bodies, and
Yeah.
Natalie's rites of passage work through her retreats. In-person retreats are such a poignant
Mm.
way of experiencing that form and meeting that for wherever you are in the physiological landscape.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the Menopause reclamation ceremony, if you haven't experienced one, is like it's really deep and beautiful work. My favorite way that it's been described as one of the women on the last retreat was like, that was psyche transforming. And it's like, yeah, that's what a rite of passage is. Yeah, so Madeline and I just encourage you women so deeply to lean on support for creating this for yourself, whatever that might look like, whether it's support from one of us, whether it's support from your community. Yeah, it's like exactly like you said, Madeline, you don't have to do this alone. That feels like pretty good place to stop. Is there anything else you wanted to share?
That's really good. Of course, I'm always like, I can talk about this for 5 more
I
hours.
don't Well, maybe you want to share where people can find you because my info is on every episode, but if you want to share a little bit about where people can find you too.
Yeah, my work is done through the umbrella of what I call tending the womb. So it's tendingthewomb.com. My Instagram is tending.the.womb, where you can reach out to me and talk about doing one-on-one work, and then offer group containers as well for us to explore fertility and connecting into our menstruating bodies and our bodies as an extension of Earth. So my website and Instagram is a great way to reach out to me and stay in contact.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, Madeline. I'm just so incredibly grateful, as always, to you, your work in the world, and the types of conversations that we can have, and the fact that this modern world allows us to have them out loud and other people to hear them. And just really, really excited for this conversation to move through the collective. And for anyone who's listening, like share this with your friends. Like this is the kind of blueprint that I really do hope spreads far and wide. Yeah. Aw, thank you.
Thank you for tuning into the wisdom of the womb today. It's truly such an honor to bring these stories forward to you, and it would mean so much to me if you'd rate and review this podcast so that it could reach more women. If you're looking for deeper support, you can find the link to join our online community, the Cyclical Living Circle, in the show notes below. There, you'll also find the links to book one-on-one virtual sessions, shop the herbal shop, and any group programs that I'm currently offering. Plus, you can follow me on Instagram, and I love to connect with you all there. All right, see you next week.